My name is Chaumtoli Huq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is an innovative platform that seeks to bring together organizers, lawyers, and activists on issues of law and social justice. I encourage folks to go to our website, lawatthemargins.com, and look at the articles there on various topics on migration, human rights, and also access to the courts. Today, I'm very excited to have a distinguished group of panelists to talk to you about Native American law and organizing. Last December, Law at the Margins had hosted a discussion with various activists, and I asked the question, what are issues that are being ignored even amongst progressive circles? Unanimously, each of the activists in labor, in immigration, and human rights have said that Native American issues and the rights of indigenous peoples around the world is a topic that all of us ignore, and sadly, many of the activists acknowledged that even they were unfamiliar with some of the issues that Native communities in America are experiencing. As we leave October Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day as it's been renamed, and approach Thanksgiving holidays, these issues need to be discussed. So today, on the topic of Native American law and organizing, I'm happy to have Cedric Woods, a citizen of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who has decades of experience with tribal government and research and is the founding director of the Institute for New England Native American Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. We're also joined by Wahleah Johns, a member of the Navajo tribe and the community of Forest Lake, which is one of the several communities atop Black Mesa, Arizona. Wahleah's work with the Black Mesa Water Coalition and the Navajo Green Economy Coalition has led to groundbreaking legislative victories around green jobs and environmental justice. And then also joining us is Nicole Friederichs, who is a practitioner in residence at Suffolk University School of Law in Boston. She teaches and manages the Suffolk Indigenous Peoples Rights Clinic, which supports tribes and indigenous communities in their nation-building activities. I'd like to thank each of them for joining us today. Also, I want to indicate that on Law at the Margins website, there's an article by Mukesh Eat Fatty, who is an indigenous person and activist in South Asia, who wrote on violence against women and indigenous communities. So I'm going to start off by inviting first Professor Friedrichs to help us understand the basics of federal Indian law. The word Indian law is the name and the sort of the law, so I just want to sort of recognize that our legal system is woefully behind in our terminology, and also help us understand what are the human rights law that covers indigenous communities. Professor Friedrichs, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I want to start off by pointing out that there are actually 4 bodies of law that are relevant for tribes and Native people in this country. First are tribal law. Tribes have their own set of laws, whether it's in a code, whether it's in a constitution, whether it's by oral tradition. And these are laws that will govern the relationships among a nation's people and their relationship to their land, their natural resources, as well as others that might engage with them. Second, state law can also apply to Native people in particular, and it might depend on the state in which a tribe is located. It might also depend on the tribe itself. So state law can apply. International law, which I'll talk about briefly at the end, international human rights law is also applicable for indigenous communities here in the United States as well as worldwide. And then finally, federal Indian law, or some people call it federal law about Indians or federal law about Native communities or tribes. Federal law is kind of paramount when it comes to tribes and Native people in this country, in the sense that our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, that is, provides that Congress has plenary authority, plenary power over tribes. If you were taking a class in law school or an undergrad, And in federal Indian law, you'd likely start off with 3 cases. There are many more cases, but because I have very little time, I'll just start off with the Marshall Trilogy, which are 3 cases that were penned by Chief Justice John Marshall in the early 1800s. And they really set the stage, at least under federal law, the kind of foundational principles that govern the relationships between tribes, the federal government, and states. So just very quickly, Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823, was the first case dealing with the relationship that tribes would have to their lands, and the relationship between the U.S. government and states as well as to that land. And this obviously is a big issue at this time when the U.S. is expanding both population-wise and moving west. So this was an issue that had to be resolved, at least from the federal perspective. So in Johnson, just quickly, basically the court said, and this is, some of the language I'll read is going to be disturbing because it really is based on kind of a racist doctrine going back to papal bulls from the 14 and 1500s. So unfortunately, these cases are still good law, and when I teach it to my students, it's very disturbing to hear this for the first time. But basically what Johnson says is that the discovery of these lands in this hemisphere, the New World, so to speak, gave Europeans, the European sovereigns, that is the British, the English, the Spanish, and the French, and then of course the United States, title good against all other Europeans and the sole right to acquire that land from tribes. So tribes could only sell to the United States and not to, for example, states. Tribes have the right to use and occupy those lands, but that right can also be extinguished by the U.S. government by purchase or conquest, and that's referred to as Indian title. So if right from the beginning you see this, what we call the discovery doctrine, kind of dictating how land was going to be dealt with. Second, 2 cases that involve the Cherokee Nation. This is a little bit later in 1830 and 1832. At this point, Georgia is very interested in gaining access to Cherokee lands and starts enacting its own laws that it extends onto Cherokee lands and over the Cherokee people and over the Cherokee government. And so the Cherokee Nation fights back, and they file a case with the U.S. Supreme Court in 1830, and the U.S. Supreme Court has to decide whether the tribe is a foreign state and therefore can exercise jurisdiction, or whether it's a state. The Supreme Court decides, well, it's something different. It's a domestic dependent nation. Again, some of the language here it uses, it talks about a domestic dependent nation, but also in a state of pupillage, recognizing a trust relationship that exists today, but it really talks about a language between a guardian and a ward, the ward obviously being a tribe and the U.S. government being its guardian. So we have a kind of a new a recognition of tribes as domestic dependent nations. And then finally, Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the Cherokee Nation goes back into court to try to get a statement or holding from the court saying, state law can't apply to us, and they eventually get that they actually do succeed. And here the Chief Justice builds on that domestic dependent nation idea and recognizes tribal sovereignty, and that tribes have the authority, the power, the control over their lands and over their peoples and whoever else is within their territory. And so Georgia law doesn't have any force within those lands. The history after these 2 cases is sad. Unfortunately, you have a victory by the Cherokee Nation, but soon after that, many of them are pushed as part of the Trail of Tears further west into Indian Territory. But that Worcester case is something that's still relied on by practitioners. So these are the kind of foundational principles of federal Indian law. Over the course of time, they've been weakened, unfortunately, but they still stand. And then just quickly, I know I'm running out of time, international human rights law. Indigenous peoples have been engaged with the international system for almost a century at this point. First with the League of Nations, with a First Nation leader going to Geneva to complain about his people's treatments by the Canadian government and saying, look, we're a separate entity, we're a separate state here, please address these problems. And that set the stage for the next few decades where Indigenous peoples continue to engage at the UN to establish and to assert their rights. And they get involved in the 1970s and the 1980s with the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007 and continues to be used increasingly by tribes here in the United States, as well as Native peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples worldwide, to assert their rights. And this declaration, in my opinion, is a kind of an articulation of human rights that we all share as individuals, but apply to Indigenous peoples, especially kind of recognizing the collective nature of their rights as opposed to individual rights that we're more focused on here in the United States. So it's something that's used quite a lot in our advocacy here at the clinic, but as well as worldwide. I'll end there just to leave. Is that good?
Are really compelling as lawyers to see how some of these objectionable language continue today. So to raise that, I appreciate that. I want to bring in Cedric to share with us that how have you've been engaged in listening circles with Native American communities and tribes in the Massachusetts region. If you can share, what are some of the issues you've been hearing through these listening circles, and also as a researcher yourself, an academic, in many of the communities, if you can share some of your own work.
Sure. Thank you, Chaumtoli, first for the opportunity to be here today. The project you're referencing specifically is a mass humanities funded project to examine the status of the social contract. And the particular communities we're looking at is what is the status of the social contract between peoples indigenous to Massachusetts, as from both a historic perspective within the state of Massachusetts, but also looking at the contemporary status of indigenous peoples globally through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We framed this by looking at two documents, the first being what's widely known as the Earl Report. It was the last comprehensive report written by the state of Massachusetts about Native peoples within the Commonwealth. And it looked at those communities with whom it had a clearly defined fiduciary responsibility, either in terms of land or other types of accounts, as well as other Native populations here, people we would call today urban Indians, or those whom were resident and indigenous from Massachusetts, but to whom it did not think it had any legal obligation. And so when we're looking at this whole framework of social contract, we're discussing this transition from a group of people who John Milton Earle described as involuntary wards of the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth had asserted full authority over their assets and property and ability to dispose of those assets with or without their consent, to a period where they were transitioning to become citizens. And what did that mean? And the way that Massachusetts viewed solving this situation from moving them from involuntary wards or subjects to citizens was to make them the same as everyone else, whether Native people desired this change to take place or not. And particularly Native people voiced objection around two main points in 1859. These points were a change in land tenure. Many of the communities still collectively owned their territory, so the Earl Report set the stage for what was the first large-scale allotment effort in the United States, and it happened here in Massachusetts in 1871, and many Native peoples were opposed to that directly. And it also was very much a gendered piece of legislation, the subsequent Enfranchisement Allotment Act, because it disenfranchised Native women who had political rights and status within their indigenous communities. So it did a variety of things, and the whole purpose of these listening sessions was to talk to contemporary Native people now in 2015 and hear from them what's happened since this report in 1859, the Allotment and Enfranchisement Act, and everything that's happened since. Because again, that's the last time the state's bothered to look on a comprehensive basis as far as what's happening with Massachusetts Native peoples. And it's no big surprise. Many of the Native communities were terribly impacted by the allotment of their lands. It greatly accelerated the loss of Native lands here in the Commonwealth, and they're still in 2015 living with the aftermath and consequences of that land loss. In some cases, it's led to dispersal of tribal populations. across a much wider area, which makes it more challenging for them to access sacred sites, to engage in traditional subsistence activities, and even to interact and be contiguous with one another and live in community with one another. Those are certainly things that have come up as a result of this. It also has led to increased issues and uncertainty in relation to the Indian Child Welfare Act and its application or lack thereof, and the status of the children of tribes who are not federally recognized in Massachusetts, and also as a result of this ambiguity in terms of status issues with things like the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act. So all of these things are items that we've heard that have come forward directly in the sessions and through subsequent conversations after the sessions. It's also been very interesting hearing from the Native youth talking about their desire to be able to connect with one another and just how challenging that is in a state like Massachusetts, where there are relatively few Native people based on its statewide population. And even in those communities where there are larger numbers of Native people, the challenges they face in achieving equitable education as books and other stereotypes are part of the current curriculum, part of the current reality of what these students deal with and its impact on them and their right to education and educational equity. And Nicole, by the way, is my co-humanities scholar on this project. So we've had 3 of the sessions so far, and we'll have 1 more in March at the North American Indian Center in Boston in Jamaica Plain.
Great, thank you, Cedric. I want to let the listeners know that on their left-hand side, there is an icon, a Q&A icon that they can use to ask questions of our guests. As we sort of wind down, I'm going to ask those questions of them. And also you can tweet questions or comments or thoughts and reflections. Just use the hashtag #LawAtMargins. Cedric, I just want to ask one follow-up question before I move on to Wahleah. Can you share, in terms of the youth and representation of themselves in books, can you share some stories? And the power of listening circles are that it gives voice to individuals' representation of themselves. And can you share some of the stories that you've heard through the circles? Examples of where perhaps young people are struggling?
Well, we've made a conscious effort to involve youth as part of this process, and in particular having youth panelists between the ages of 18 to 25, so it's older youth, but certainly youth. And we've asked them to talk about what do you see as the hope for the future. We've talked a lot about what has happened in the past and where things are now, but where do you hope it can go? And one of the youth panelists gave a very poignant account about how her community has survived for hundreds of years, on the margins, if you will. But she really is looking forward to the chance to be able to thrive as a Native person in Massachusetts. And it was very clear that she did not feel that the state, the Commonwealth, was there yet to create an environment that was truly welcoming and even recognizing that Native people still existed. And that's one of the things that they encountered perpetually, is being referred to in the past tense. And even one parent was talking about her daughter, who I think is in the 6th grade now, and her experiences in school when people ask, well, do any of you know any Native people at all? And her classmates, none of them recognizing that they had a Native classmate there with them, even though she had shared with them multiple times that she indeed was an Indigenous person, Indigenous student there. So this challenge of invisibility, of being at the margins and marginalized, is being an ongoing part of the struggle that Indigenous youth face, also looking for greater connection with one another, and how to better access and benefit from what the universities are doing. Lots of educational institutions, lots of people working in the field of Native studies, Native and non-Native allies as well. But how can we better connect and support one another? All those things were concerns that the youth brought forward directly at the session. And Nicole, if I missed anything, by all means chime in.
Yeah, no, we're gonna come back to how non-native folks or just can be allies in this, and hopefully this program is sort of a beginning of that. I want to bring in Wahleah Johns to talk about your specific work around environmental justice, environmental movements, and your work with the Black Mesa Coalition. So if you could share about the work that you're doing and why is the environmental justice movement important to Native communities, Native American communities.
Thank you, Chaumtoli. Thank you all for your presentations. Yat e do hehe she Wahleah Johns inishya shihin nishlan do she bashichin the desani dashaya do kia ani dashanella. Just introduced myself, and for all those folks who I'm related to or trying to make relations to, we always introduce ourselves so we can create connection and relationships. So I'm from northern Arizona on the Navajo reservation, Navajo Nation, a place called Black Mesa, and I come from lands that, where I'm building my home about 5 miles away is one of the largest coal strip mines. Peabody Coal Company has been mining there for over 50 years, and we started to organize about, I would say, 15 years ago to protect our groundwater, and it was more of a calling to, well, one is just to understand our communities and understand our own history as from our elders and from our people about the impacts of, I guess, fossil fuel extraction. In particular with this would be coal mining in our communities. And when you hear the stories from the local people, that's when you start to understand that there's this education that is not taught in school, but it's an education that you learn in your community, and these stories, the stories and the narratives. And I think that's, that and tying in with, like, research, actual research on the water table of our, in Black Mesa. There was so much water that Peabody Coal Company was using every day, 3 million gallons, just to slurry coal, move coal, transport coal through a pipeline, a 300-mile pipeline from northern Arizona all the way to Laughlin, Nevada. And this is pristine groundwater. It's called the Navajo Aquifer. So we learned a lot on the science side about our aquifer. We also learned how to present this in our communities, especially communities that are only Navajo-speaking communities. And so how you use popular education to and visuals to really translate, what is actually happening, the history, and engage people to create a movement to be able to protect our groundwater. And so that's what we did with a lot of people. I mean, not just me, there's many people that were involved. And so that's what was the core of our formation of Black Mesa Water Coalition, is that we wanted to protect our groundwater because we feel that this is essential for our people and our communities, our future generations, that we have the luxury of using this beautiful water, and we need to, think about the future generations and what are they going to have. And so that was our calling. And so since then we've been successful in protecting our groundwater. In 2006, Peabody stopped using the water for the slurry. It shut down one of the mines, and it shut down a coal plant in Laughlin, Nevada. But it also, we understood what the impact would be on jobs because of one mine closure. A lot of our people work at the mines, coal mines, and it's a huge revenue source for our tribe. So we started to organize around what does the transition look like. Even we don't know the future of coal, we don't know the future of this economy, but how do we as people and communities live more self-sufficient lifeways that is in line with our cultural values, and started to look at just transition kind of ideas of communities that have experienced boom and bust of anything, whether it's asphalt or fossil fuel copper. What, instead of them, mining and then leaving because there's no more deposits, what is that transition method look like for workers and for communities? And so we started to explore renewable energy. We started to explore green economy. We started to explore even our own traditional economy that is a hidden economy that's not really recognized. but it's there, and that's what's been sustaining a lot of our people in Navajo Nation. And so that's, that's been the kind of the strategy around, green to us as Native people looks, it's pretty easy. It's not like a new concept. And so as this like kind of green movement was approaching, was that, well, we know what that is, and we understand it. It's just we got to water these seeds that have been there for, thousands of years, and it's going to take that collective wisdom. It's going to take that that collective acting, and and that participation to be able to be that self-sufficient nation that we were, and that and I think that's the aim for our organization, is to promote that. So we have a wool program that's focused on supporting people who have sheep, cattle, horses, but mostly sheep, and looking at the wool that's on our reservation. Can we add value to that? Can we give, for the hard work that people put in every day to raise these amazing animals, and that is life for them, and how do we support that mechanism? And the other is around food sovereignty, is like, organizing to revive the old cornfields, the old, food fields in our communities. And then also looking at water and ways of preserving our water in our watershed and restoring them. It's looking at, energy. Energy is the biggest economic, you need energy to do any kind of economy these days. And as a community that's closest to one of the largest coal mining operations, to talk about renewable energy has been a challenge, and, we're just trying to work, by schools or by small community buildings, just to, introduce a kind of an innovative technology that depends on, light that shines on us for over 300 days a year. So that's what, and throughout all this work, we're still dealing with the big pollution. We have about 8,000 megawatts of coal power pollution that surround or are on our reservation. And this has supplied all of the Southwest electrical needs for 50 years. And it's, it's come at the expense of people's health, and our traditional values, and our precious water. So that's the hard part. And I think we've been challenging legally with different challenging Office of Surface Mining, different entities to raise their standards of protection of our water, raise their standards of protection of air quality, actually have input and a voice that is informed, fully informed, and even though a lot of our communities speak a different language, it's what does that look like when an EIS, environmental impact statement, is approaching our communities, and so it's not, we can't read a 700-page EIS, it's like, even, someone well-educated, it's to make a comment to that kind of book, and that's what our tribes and our people are faced with all the time, like the Keystone, all of these big projects. The government has a system, and they release these big EISs, and they expect, my grandmother or, my relatives to read it and, write, and, that's their informed, process, which is not, I don't think it's informed enough for our people. And so I think like the free, prior, informed consent is one concept, in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we've been really trying to incorporate, but in a way that's appropriate for us, and every community can make that their own. So that's just a little, yeah. So, but really, it's inspiring work, and really proud of a lot of people putting in volunteer time and, the effort.
Great, thank you. I want to encourage folks who are listening to, if they have questions, to ask them now using the Q&A feature on the Google chat on the left-hand side, or to tweet comments using #law@theMargins. Well, I do want to follow up on two things. I know that you've worked on some legislative issues, and hearing from Nicole around how the law seems to be, countering the interests of Native American communities. How has it been working within sort of the legal system? You gave one example of environmental impact statement and environmental laws, which are kind of very circumscribed and, in my view, very much on the side of business interests, to be frank. How has it been working within the sort of legal spaces which seem to deny the lives and cultures of Native American peoples, but at the same time, it seems like you are using those spaces. So can you speak to that experience a little bit?
Yeah, it's fairly simple. I mean, since we started organizing, we started to we understood the need. We understood that this, even there's so many examples like Arizona Snow Bowl. They is a big ski resort in northern Arizona, wants to make snow using reclaimed wastewater in northern Arizona on a sacred mountain, a mountain that's sacred to more than 20 tribes, and it's a desecration. So even that was just an example. I mean, is that they released an EIS, they release alternatives, of like what A, B is C, and that's it. And, we've learned a lot from that experience. We learned a lot from Peabody trying to expand their mining operations, and we actually were successful in overturning, certain decisions that were made in 2008 to expand the mine. We actually went back and said, no, this does not seem right, and these are the reasons that we weren't informed in the right way. So I think it's new for Peabody and the Office of Surface Mining to be feeling the pressure. I think it's new for USDA and different entities that are the Department of Agriculture, to their approach to community and indigenous peoples, and when it comes to culture and our way of life, and just the differences in languages that. It's not as simple as putting out an EIS and expecting us to just respond by written comments. That it has to be translated, and then asking for a different alternative. Asking for one of the coal plants to just, by this date, transition to renewable energy. That should be an alternative, not what the federal government is proposing as an alternative. So it's really, making sure that we are informed about the process, but we are also guiding. And that takes, mediation a lot of times to bring parties together and talk it through before you start to do litigation. And so that's been our strategy, for years. And but within tribal nation, we have, for Navajo, we have the Dine Fundamental Law. That is a beautiful document that talks about who we are, and from a spiritual and cultural philosophy and way, and I think that's one thing that we haven't really used yet within our own tribe to challenge these, these operations. So.
Okay. So we do have two questions. I think the first one may be appropriate for Cedric, but again, I want to invite anyone to answer them and to also raise other issues that are not coming up in the questions. I don't want us to be limited by that. This is really a conversation, and it's a first, hopefully not the last of many. The question, Cedric, is how does a condition of reservations continue to impact the future for Indigenous people?
I guess first, Chaumtoli, I'd have to kind of unpack that question. Condition of reservations. There are lots of different conditions on lots of different reservations, and instead of reservations, I really would prefer and want to emphasize the term homelands, because in many cases these are our indigenous spaces where we were created and still are very closely connected with. In some cases, Native people have been kicked out of their homelands and are now someplace quite far removed from their origins, but definitely have formed a relationship with those newer places. But in relation to Massachusetts Native peoples, what I was hearing very clearly was the action of state policy to sever the relationship with homeland. and to disperse them across the countryside and to fundamentally alter how they were able to interact or live with a particular place. And that is certainly an ongoing challenge for the future viability of Native communities, is how to best live with our spaces and to how we can try to regain access to those spaces, whether it's through advocacy, legal action, or alliance building. And I'd posit it's all of the above. And your second part of the question is, how is this impacted by current organizing? I'd say that Native folks have certainly figured out over the last 500 years one type of approach is not successful all the time. So we have to be policy innovators, if you will, or policy entrepreneurs, to figure out different ways to try to protect homelands, to regain homeland, and to be able to access and protect sacred spaces and homelands.
Great. I would actually follow up on that, Cedric, in terms of the use of our words and language, and to unpack that. Are there other ways in which, or how we even frame the questions or how we talk about the issues need to be changed? Are there other examples in which those folks who are listening, including myself participating and moderating, should be mindful of, and maybe they reflect a certain politic or viewpoint that is not centered around Native Americans? I think that your unpacking that was really great. So are there other things that we should be mindful of? And this is also open to anyone else, but let's start with Cedric.
Well, there's a very long list. I guess I'll just stay focused on the topic of land.
Okay.
Because frequently my undergraduate students will say, well, the federal government gave Native peoples these lands. And it's like, whoa, stop, time out. There's not a gift of anything. The term reservation itself means land reserved by Native people for themselves for their own use. But again, it's more appropriately homelands of different indigenous peoples. That's what the reservation aspect of it is. Now, Nicole can go into lots of detail about homelands as federal reservations, just like a military federal reservation, and what that means in terms of the framework for federal Indian law and policy. And that's a much lengthier question, but those are some of the things that just pop up immediately. Misconceptions people have about Native people and land, the origin of the land, the title of the land, who belongs to the land, as much as land belonging to us. Which land do we belong to? And how has that relationship been challenged, complicated, as a result of hundreds of years of colonial activity and dispossession?
Great. Thank you. So we're going to slowly wind down, but I want to make sure that those who are listening ask their questions using the Q&A function. The second question that I want to pose to everyone, and maybe I think Nicole mentioned that she may be able to tackle it first, is how has the current social justice movements in the United States impacted Native communities? And I'm imagining that question may be referencing to Black Lives Matter, environmental justice movement around the Keystone Pipeline, trade issues that have been terrorism, all of these sort of other issues. How have they been impacted on Native American organizing or discussions within their communities?
Well, I can try to answer that. I think just following up on what Cedric was saying is that I think Indigenous peoples have been fighting for a long time. So in some ways, I know there are connections between those movements, but Indigenous peoples have been doing this, like I said, for hundreds of years, and so they've had to explore and try different ways of organizing since the colonialists arrived 400, 500 years ago. I know when we do our international human rights advocacy at the UN, we're one of many groups there. But like I said, the history of Indigenous peoples at the international level, for example, extends way back to the early kind of 1900s. And I don't know this for certain, but I wonder if there's kind of influence going the other way in terms of how Indigenous peoples have engaged and whether there are influence organizing going on elsewhere. Yeah, I don't know if the other panelists have something to add to that. I mean, they're the organizers out there as well.
Great. Wahleah or Cedric, do you want to answer that question? How are the current social justice movements in the United States impacting the organizing in the Native American communities? Are those issues being addressed?
Yeah, I think I think for Native communities or organizers, there's a lot happening on the ground. A lot of, and it's interesting, it's mostly mom and pop, and it's mostly female leaders that, are grassroots. They don't really have an organization, or they're just kind of like doing it so for their survival, for their people. And that's inspiring, and that's kind of like how our story has been, and I think there's a huge momentum building throughout. As I got introduced to the Indigenous Environmental Network, they took me many places, even to India, to all around the world, meet other Indigenous peoples on the front lines of extraction, on the front lines of, kind of extinction, and because of the policies, they're really similar throughout the world to take away from who we are as Indigenous peoples. And I think that bond is really strong, even ever more. I'm feeling it from down in South America to all the way up to Alaska, that Indigenous women are rising up and communities are rising up. We have a treaty that the Indigenous women that came together recently, and that's what they're taking to Conference of Parties 21 in Paris in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And actually next week. And I'm one of those people that are attending the climate negotiations. And with Indigenous Environmental Network, I have to give them a lot of credit for even just that network to help us meet one another and encourage one another, and to stand in our communities, and that we're not alone. And I think that's the most powerful work, is that the people that are from these communities are taking the initiative to provide the solutions and provide the defending our homeland approach, and doing what we can to do that, and supporting one another and alliance building. But also, we just come from that Indigenous lens too, is that we honor our Mother Earth, we honor everything around us. That's how it's always been, and that's how we're going to continue to move forward. And I think when it comes to social justice topics, we can relate for sure, and yeah. And recently we invited 2 women, one from where the tar sands in northern Alberta are happening, and from North Dakota, near Fort Berthold, Candy Mossett. We invited them to our homelands in Navajo. This was last month, to talk about violence against women, violence against Mother Earth, and that this core connection that is there. What are the roots? Where does that come from and stem from? And why are we allowing companies to take over our lands even more and create energy colonies for extraction? And what does this mean for our community, our children, our women? We have countless documents that show that Indigenous women in the last decade have the highest per capita, of missing, murdered. And what are tribes doing about it, tribal nations? And so that was the conversation we had on Navajo Nation. Is we brought leaders in to listen to these stories, that there needs to be stronger safeguards for Indigenous women, that where extraction companies are coming into their homelands, but also just so much education that is needed and sharing. So I think that's one example of like how we are trying to plug in and help one another. But it's a hard topic, it's a tough subject to have, but it has to happen.
Great. So before I bring in Cedric, I just want to follow up, Wahleah. I'm glad you mentioned the Indigenous Peoples Environmental Network. As I understand, they've been a key player in the voting down of the Keystone Pipeline. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the organizing that was led and centered by Native American communities. And I see a lot of press around it, and a lot of the congratulations is going to Obama, and fine, rightly so. But I'm feeling like a lot of the organizing work by a number of the communities is slowly getting not told as often. So maybe you can share what you know in terms of the work that went into that victory.
Yeah, it's the community organizing. It's people within the tribal nation, the community members, tribal members organizing and putting pressure on their tribal nation to really take a stand on behalf of their homelands and to protect it. And I think at scale, this project with Keystone XL was massive, and that, and telling the life cycle of such a, industry has been abusive to our Mother Earth, and, linking it to tar sands. And that's where Melina, was from, who we brought from the tar sands region. And she, is, our community is right there in the heart of the tar sands, and they're dealing with a lot of the impacts. So I think when you make that relationship between, like, from the extraction and exploration to all the, the burning to the transportation and the overall global impact it might have, I think that helps to inform people to make a better decision, like our tribal leaders. And it was it took everybody and everyone in different tribes, and the Indigenous Environmental Network was also a key player, and a lot of people came together, artists, Native musicians, and celebrities, and even just the everyday people that live in these communities that they have the right to say no. And I think that was awesome. So but there's still a lot of pressure, for tribes to give in, and it's still ongoing. The thing that we haven't really mentioned is that there's another pipeline that's already continuing to go towards Texas, and that people and communities are really sad, even though Keystone got voted, or was not was rejected. There's this other pipeline that is, going towards Texas, and it's sad for other communities because they rerouted it basically.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, that's another part that I'm just learning. But yeah, I think it's with this movement, it's going to get stronger, and because we have the the technology, and we have the ability to share in like this forum, and I think that this is really helpful for all of us to share our stories. But I just want to appreciate the other speakers too, because I love Nicole's introduction to just reminding that reminder of, like, these laws are set up just to always control us, and these are the things that we deal with every day, and the work that we do is like, how do we get around to be able to protect our water, our land, and our air, and our people, and that's the challenge. Is these laws have always been set up to control us and to create our destiny, which is not what we, it's totally against our philosophy. So, but yeah.
Great. So I think we're going to close at 1:30 exactly. So I want to encourage folks, if they have any last questions, to pose that now. I do want to give Cedric to respond to, I guess, the second question, which was, like, how has the current social justice movements in the United States impacted Native American communities and organizing? They weren't specific about which movements, but I guess it could be environmental, the education, the activism across campuses that are happening. Maybe you could speak to that, especially around your work with Native American youth. I've seen Native Lives Matter as a conversation to Black Lives Matter on Twitter. So, however you would like to respond, but just how the broader social justice movements impacted. And then I think I'm going to ask each panelist to just end with maybe things that we have not covered as a closing remark, so that we can close this session today.
I'm first going to wade into this, picking up from some of the things that Wahleah talked about in relation to just the global connections, international connections of Indigenous activists. One of the things a point I try to drive home to my student is that these borders are legal fictions between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico. And our Indigenous communities were on both sides of those borders, and technology's allowed us to help reconnect in ways that geography and the international political realities made it much more challenging to do so. So the work that's happened in the United States is certainly greatly informed by our Indigenous cousins who were in Alberta and the tar sands area. Because you can bet that what we're hearing about what's happening there, we're getting the first-hand accounts of what's happening in their communities, and we don't want to go through the same type of crisis that they're dealing with. And so whether it's Idle No More, whether it's the tar sands and the Keystone XL pipeline, these Indigenous connections are continuing to grow, and as my fellow panelists pointed out, continuing to strengthen the resolve on both sides of the border, particularly in Canada, where there's so much more of a significant number of the population, particularly in the western provinces of Canada. And so I'm hoping that that will continue to inspire folks south of that border and then south of the other border as well, so we can look for better ways to connect and support one another as far as these international agreements, because we're almost always, we're the miner's canary. We're the first ones impacted when things start to go wrong, and I don't think that's changed any at all from when Felix Cohen wrote about it in the early 20th century.
Great. Did you want to maybe, are there questions or topics that we haven't covered during this time that at least to bring up and maybe make some closing remarks? Cedric, sorry.
I really think that I'm just glad to be part of the panel. It's been a really informative conversation, and I look forward to participating in some other ones and being able to log on and see some other ones that you've done in the past.
Great. This is actually the first, and it, yes, and it came about because through a review process that we had last year on issues that were being ignored amongst progressive circles, because Law at the Margins brings together progressive folks in law and organizing, and they acknowledged, as I maybe I didn't say clearly, that they acknowledged that we were woefully uneducated and sometimes, oftentimes don't include Native American communities in discussions. And so, so hopefully this will be not the last, but the first of other conversations and events. So maybe what are other issues do you think that we should be focusing on for our future events? And how can people do better in terms of supporting Native American organizing? Maybe that could be a question to end with.
I mean, I can speak to that. I think we formed our own nonprofit organization, and it took a long time. It was years of volunteer, but there was really no support in like how to start an organization, and so we all learned from scratch. And I think there are definitely ways that we can support other people to just, what are the first steps to starting a nonprofit, but just even fundraising is, you actually have to do something really big and, to be able to get recognized in the environmental kind of movement and with foundations and money, And what I've learned recently is like, less than 2% of the foundation philanthropic, monies go to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous organizations. And so it's an astounding number. And when you have, most of the biodiversity sitting next to 80%, of the world's biodiversity is near or on Indigenous peoples' land and territories. And I think that, with tribal nations here in the U.S., we have a lot of topics to address and a lot of need. In our communities, 18,000 homes don't have electricity. 40% of our people don't have running water. And these are just, you go up to South Dakota, similar numbers, and high unemployment rate, 50%. you know, I think as Native people, we maybe there's a misperception and a lot of misconceptions about, you know, we maybe get per diems or something like that, or not per diems, but, you know, per capita. And no, we don't, you know, and so there's just also those type of conversations we also need to be having in states that we're in and schools that we're in. I used to talk to local universities near our reservation, and a lot of the students didn't even know where, you know, any tribal nations were. So it takes that kind of introductory to to students and young people to understand too, and I think that's so important, so that there's that respect and there's that you know, building alliances and you know, yeah. So I would just say that it's just when it comes to even just organizing, it can be challenging and it can be fun, and but I do think there is a big call for a lot of amazing work to support on the ground.
Great, and maybe separately on the event page, I can enlist your support in listing a number of the organizations to which maybe listeners can actually support. I think it's actually outrageous that only 2% of foundation money goes to. I think that actually should be a huge charge. Recently, the Ford Foundation, not calling them out just because they put forth their platform on inequality, and seems like this is an area to fund. So I just want to end with perhaps Nicole and Cedric, any last concluding remarks, specifically that the folks who will be listening may, or maybe may not, who knows, be outside of the Indigenous communities, and so how can they support organizing or the work? Maybe you can share that, and then we'll conclude with Cedric.
There are lots of Native nonprofits who do valuable work within various Indigenous communities, and I would encourage your listeners to look at some of their pages, which Chaumtoli, I can send some links to you, to participate into events and to directly support them through participating in donations. As Wahleah pointed out, the foundations, it's a very difficult mechanism and game in which to be involved. And minus resources, it's extremely difficult for us to do this very important work.
Great. Please do that, and I'm actually thinking if it's, because I'm a lawyer by training but organizer in heart, that we should take this entire month and I can feature each organization on our Law at the Margins Facebook page with a link to the groups, and if everyone's in this phase of grace and giving, I think that the appropriate way is to give to the organizing that is happening. So if I can enlist your support in listing organizations that are doing on-the-ground work, I'm happy to use Law at the Margins platform to promote the work. So Nicole, maybe we'll end with you then on sort of ways in which we can support, and then I'd like to, then we'll conclude.
Well, I just wanted to point out that there's such a limitation of the law with regards to Indigenous peoples in this country in terms of finding solutions. And I have found in the short time I've been doing this that going into court isn't really sometimes not an option, first of all, for communities, or it's just not a good place to go because you're usually losing in court, whether it's at the Supreme Court or even further down. So when I have a client come in or a community come in and they have an issue, especially around land or any other issue, going to court isn't really the option. And so that's where the organizing piece comes in, and that's why these communities are organizing around these issues in the way that they are. And also part of it is the education piece. I know here in New England, Cedric and I spend a lot of time just educating people about the history. People just don't know, whether it's even in a primary school or even at the college level or even, a JD. They just don't know, and we have found that you have to really start with just educating of kind of the general public before you can even get to a place where you're starting to address an issue. So here in New England, you're talking about severe land loss, but people don't know how that happened. And so Cedric and I, our approach is if we can educate people about that history, then they're going to be more engaged in terms of trying to find solutions. So there's really that kind of connect between where the law really does not find solutions, except if you go maybe internationally. But federally, it's not a great place, in my opinion, and that's where the organizing and education piece can come in. So, not so much, what to do next, but more just kind of pointing out that, the kind of where the two connect and why it's so important to have the two.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. I know that from your other experience, you've been doing some cases with the clinic on Indigenous communities around the world. Maybe you can come back and talk about that work in a subsequent program. I want to thank Cedric, Wahleah, and Nicole, all of you, for generously and graciously giving of your time. I know all of you are extremely busy, and I was sort of really wanted to make this happen. I didn't want another year to go by. We are doing a Justice in Review again in December to reflect back in 2015, and I did not want another year to pass without at least beginning this conversation. I hope each of you will come back, and thank you again all for participating, and we will make this video available for those who could not watch it simultaneously, and we'll share with you. And again, I want to extend Law at the Margins as a platform to do the education and webinars if you see that as a fit, and also to perhaps highlight the organizations to which we should be donating and giving during this I guess, holiday season, as they say in the United States. So thank you all, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gosh.